Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining in from. Warm welcome to all of you who have already joined up. Welcome to the next edition of Digitates of Kanban webinars that we bring to you roughly about a month. Today's webinar is Alexei Zheglov's Kanban Mailbag. This is the name that he gave to the webinar, and I think it is a rather interesting label. It's a different webinar this time where we're going to focus on questions that have been sent to us by our audience, our listeners, and Alexei will take those up as soon as we turn the presentation over to him. Let's get started. While people are still joining, I will cover some of the basics, the housekeeping, etc. So we'll start with some introductions, a quick word about Digite and Swift Kanban, and then I will hand over the session to Alexei for his Q&A session. Of course, this whole webinar is all Q&A, but at the end of it, for those of you who hadn't had a chance to send a question in, after you listen to Alexei, if you have further questions, we'd be happy to answer those as well for you. So stay tuned, and if you have any questions, you can certainly ask those during the webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send you a recording after the webinar is done with a follow-up email. The questions that you have will be taken up using the Q&A box that you should see on your GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side. You can enter the questions anytime, and we'll take them up as time permits by the end of the webinar. So with that, let's get some introductions. Most of you should probably know of Alexei already. Alexei is the founder and principal consultant of Lean A to Z, based out of Toronto. My name is Mahesh Singh. I'm co-founder and senior vice president for marketing at Digite. A little bit more about Alexei for those of you who may not know him. He's been active in the Kanban community for so many years that I don't remember how long back it has been. I know that I met him probably in the 2011-12 timeframe, and it's been an honor to be associated with him, working with him, and learning from his contributions to the Kanban community. He's based out of Canada, but of course he does his consulting work worldwide. He's made several important contributions to the Kanban body of knowledge and enterprise services planning, and particularly around metrics and forecasting and the new field of fitness for purpose. In fact, as probably many of you know also, he is the co-author with David Anderson of the book Fit for Purpose, How Modern Businesses Find, Satisfy, and Keep Customers. And currently he's writing another book as well. Perhaps he might talk a little bit about it. Of course, Alexei is recognized as a KCP, a Kanban Coaching Professional, and an AKT, an Accredited Kanban Trainer from the LKU. And he's known especially for his quantitative and statistical methods, knowledge, and depth of his work there. And many of you are probably intimately familiar with that as well. Before I turn over the session to Alexei, let me just quickly give you an introduction to Digite and Swift Kanban for those of you who may not know us too much. Digite has been a pioneer in web-based collaboration and products and solutions. Obviously, for geographically distributed teams that need these products, these are our customers and users. We are headquartered out of Cupertino, California. We have customers worldwide and over 750,000 users that use all of our products. Our products predominantly cover Lean, Agile, Kanban, application lifecycle management, and project portfolio management. And of course, Swift Kanban is our flagship Lean Kanban product. Based on the technology that we built along with Swift Kanban, we have done a number of other products as well. And we can certainly learn more about those at our website. About Swift Kanban in particular, probably 60 to 70% of our customers tend to be software engineering teams or product development teams or IT DevOps teams. So they use the product for managing all of their work around these areas. But we also have a bunch of use cases around portfolio management, and especially the enterprise and portfolio capabilities of Swift Kanban and enterprise services planning give you the ability to model portfolios using our portfolio lanes, build a hierarchy of work that depicts different types of hierarchies for portfolios, software objects, or other contexts of your work where you have natural hierarchies of work that you have. Risk management is part of our ESP capability that you can do in order to select the work that needs to be taken up next and prioritize work for your teams. And of course, a lot of analytics around the enterprise services planning to help you and learn from your own data and be able to forecast your performance based on what your data is telling you. Besides that, of course, Swift Kanban is used by non-IT, non-software functions in a lot of different ways, whether it's marketing or procurement or HR or similar such functions. And we have a huge range of people who also use us for personal Kanban uses, so whether it is managing your own personal work or family chores or any such application. In fact, we have a couple of templates on our website for those of you who might want to use it for personal Kanban as well. One of the key things that we are known for is the range of analytics that we provide, which really help you focus on implementing the Kanban method and really give you a lot of insight into your teams and your organizational capabilities and help you, become more predictable, help you make commitments that you can keep. And we are quite happy with the feedback that we get from our customers around the analytics that we provide. And finally, last slide here, just a quick show of some of our key customers, some known brands and names there that I'm sure you will recognize. These companies use us in a wide range of applications that I just talked about. So with that, let me turn over the session to Alexei. Alexei, a very warm welcome to you, and let me go ahead and make you presenter. Just give me a second here. And you should be seeing the invitation to share your screen now.
All right. Thank you, Mahesh, for the introduction. I'm just about to go into the presentation mode. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone who is listening to this webinar. Mahesh and I decided to do this webinar some time ago and decided to go for this unusual format. It's a huge experiment for us, and some things worked out as we expected, and some things surprised us. What surprised us was the kind of questions we actually got. Because before we actually reached out to all of you members of the audience to fill in a box on your registration form with your question, we had some ideas, some 6 subject areas that we thought your questions would come from. And as it turned out, actually most of your questions were about something else. So that basically validated our whole idea of asking you to ask us questions, because if we simply prepare the presentation, or I prepare the presentation about those 6 subject areas, I'd probably spend the next hour talking about something that's of no interest to you. So that worked out really well. However, another part that didn't work out very well was the timing of the submission of those questions. Actually, quite a lot of them came within the last 24 hours. That means there was not a lot of time to prepare well-developed answers, although I'll try to do my best. And also, to be fair, several good questions came earlier than that, and so I had some time to prepare a more developed answer and give some good guidance. And I was also able to identify 2 interesting clusters of questions where I'll probably spend more time today. And those 2 clusters are about project management and dependencies. There are some questions about fit for purpose and metrics as well. So let's start with Kanban and project management.
So Alexei, let me just quickly interrupt you for a second. So the way that you have projected your screen, we are seeing the speaker view of your slides, and it is not the full screen view. So you might want to just switch to the slideshow view.
So it's a slideshow. Let's try again. For some reason I switched to the slideshow and it's showing me this. Hide presenter view. Okay, so let's do something like that. Is this better, Mahesh?
So right now we are in the slides view, not in, yeah, there you go. And maybe if you could just minimize, yeah, perfect. That's it, we are good to go now. Thank you.
All right, I'll just stick it in the corner. All right, so Kanban, and sorry for this mishap, and thank you, Mahesh, for instant feedback. So hopefully the rest of the webinar will go more smoothly. So the first set of questions deals with Kanban and project management. And so the very first question here was, I am new to Kanban and I'm looking to learn more about using it as a project management tool. So something that happens within the first half hour of the very first likely Kanban training class, known as Kanban System Design or KMP1, that is offered by a good number of good accredited Kanban trainers around the world on every continent in many countries, is this. Kanban is not a project management method. It takes 30 minutes in an accredited Kanban training class to get to this point. So it's not a tool you can use for, it's not a tool you use for project management. However, there's some good news here. You can use Kanban to deliver better projects more predictably. And if you study Kanban further, such as you don't leave the classroom after those 30 minutes and ask your accredited trainer for a refund, you can become a better project manager. And that leads me to the next question, which continues the first question and continues the theme of project management. What is the role of a project manager in a project of some kind that uses Kanban? Well, in a nutshell, project manager plus Kanban equals a better risk manager. And once you employ a better risk manager on a project, you get better projects. So here's a Kanban view of a project. So with Kanban, we model the work as it actually happens. We visualize and make explicit what people actually do. And so if a group of people happen to be working on a project, a Kanban view of it might look like this. So projects are large batches of work. And on the left side of this picture, so whether you're familiar with how to read a Kanban board or not, you can see there is a large batch of work items known as the project scope. And that's what you start with. At the same time, on the right-hand side of the board, you can see another large batch of work items that is gathering. Those are work items that are ready to be handed over to the customer. So we plan in large batches and we deliver in large batches. That's the nature of projects. And what we do with Kanban is we make these work items flow. We make them flow faster, more predictably, in the right sequence, and that leads to predictable project delivery with the least amount of risk. And so if you're a project manager learning and applying Kanban, that's the impact you make on your projects, and your projects get better. How does this work practically? So here's an example of a real project. And here we see a cumulative flow diagram. Now, some of the members of the audience, I assume, are quite advanced and they know how to read the cumulative flow diagram, but it's possible that someone, particularly if they're only starting with Kanban, may not be yet up to speed on how to make such diagrams or how to read them, and what different lines and patterns in this diagram mean. So I'll explain just a little bit. By the way, it also means studying Kanban will involve learning to make such charts and learning to read them, learning to apply them, to make some practical decisions, and so there's definitely some value in that. So by all means, learn Kanban. So what we see in this diagram is a very large gray triangle in the bottom right-hand area, and that's a growing batch of completed work, and not just work really, but customer value. So it grows at a pretty steady pace throughout the project. And the blue and orange stripes, very thin stripes, that's the work in progress. And you can see that the work in progress here is fairly constrained. It isn't perfectly constrained. It actually fluctuates quite a bit. But the manager of this project has never let the amount of work in progress grow too much. And when it hit a certain number, that project manager gave some instructions to the staff that at this moment it is really important to finish some of the work before starting some new work in order to keep this project on track. This is a cumulative flow diagram of a healthy project. This is what it looks like, and if your project cumulative flow diagram doesn't look like this, you need some trouble. So important thing here is on the vertical axis of a cumulative flow diagram, when you apply Kanban to projects, you want to track work items that are not merely tasks. These should be customer recognizable, customer valuable items. In Kanban terminology, we call them work item types. And in this particular example, what is going on, it's a data center migration project, and the work item is defined in customer recognizable terms. It used to run over there, and now it runs over here. That's something a customer can recognize. So this project is not full of tasks such as let's set up storage for this server. It's not a task that an external customer would recognize. However, if they're currently using an application based on the prior infrastructure, and now they can run it on the new infrastructure, that's a value they can recognize. And what the project manager accomplished throughout this project is that the key metrics of this project do add up. So about 120 valuable work items delivered in 6 months. That means you need the service delivery capability with the throughput of about 20 items per month. Now I'm grossly simplifying it. The actual delivery rate needed is a little higher than that due to some mathematical effects of probability, which I won't go into. But as a very rough estimate, if you want to get 120 things done and you have 6 months, you need capability to deliver 20 things per month. It's a very simple math, very simple to get. Do you have evidence in your existing process, in your existing organizational unit that you are employing for the purposes of your project? Do you have evidence that that unit can actually produce at that rate? If you don't, perhaps your project is in trouble from day one, right? If you do, well, you're probably doing great already. And besides this very simple math, here's the number of items, here's the desired timeline, here's your average delivery rate. There is another very important, even more important relationship between quantities known as Little's Law. So you are going to sustain a certain delivery rate throughout the project. Well, how many work items are you going to have in process at the same time? Do you have capacity to work on so many work items concurrently? Do you have appropriate staff, appropriate services provision to sustain that level of concurrency? And also, what will the work item lead time be? How long would it take for a work item to get from the left side of your project Kanban board to the right side of your Kanban board. So these three quantities, the work item lead time, the number of work items in process, and the delivery rate are connected using this simple formula known as Little's Law. Yes, there are several conditions to Little's Law. I won't go into that detail. And here's a very simple project forecast, and it's surprising how many real-world projects are so sloppily managed because people are unaware of very simple facts about Kanban. Again, this is where Kanban education helps a project manager. But actually, quite a few projects fail this simple test. So you can do it literally on a napkin or on an index card. So start by asking, okay, are you a project manager? Are you managing a project? How many requirements are there in this project? It's a very simple question that a person unaware of the subject matter of the project, or unaware of any project management technique, understands that that's a reasonable question to ask about any project, and it's very reasonably to expect the project manager to have a very solid answer to that question. Now, the number of requirements means there will be some number of work items to be delivered in the project. Sometimes a single work item satisfies some requirements. Sometimes you need multiple work items to satisfy a requirement. So a project manager should be able to figure out how many work items are there in the project. What is the approximate project timeline? Well, here in this particular example, it was given in work days, not counting weekends. Number was about 96 or about 5 months. But in this particular example, the assumption was that there would be no work on weekends, and people decided to literally count work days rather than months. So if we divide these two quantities, we arrive at a target delivery rate of about 2 items per month, per day. Now we need to look for evidence in the current processes of this company that there is actually a group that provides a service that delivers work items of this type that can sustain this delivery rate. And this delivery rate will be also connected to 2 metrics, such as work item lead time, how quickly you can deliver a work item of this type, and how many such items you will keep in progress concurrently in your project. And so what's surprisingly, half of the project will fail in the top left corner of this napkin forecast. They simply do not have an answer to this question. More than half of the remaining projects will fail in the middle of this napkin. There is no evidence that the organization has delivery capability that the project requires. And in some cases, the actual capability and the desired capability are off quite a bit. Sometimes by a factor of 2. I have seen by a 0 at the end. And more than half of the remaining project plans will fail the third test. They don't have the underlying service delivery capability that maintains WIP controls and has lead time that is reasonably capable, meaning it has to be relatively short, and also reasonably predictable. So such as the worst case for the work item delivery, let's say not much different than the average. And if you pass all these tests, which puts you in the top 5% of project managers in the world likely, you can do even more sophisticated things with Kanban, such as Monte Carlo simulation of your project, which gets you in a whole new league of risk management, which takes you to even greater heights of managing projects with Kanban now, of course, and delivering them in a healthy, sustainable, and predictable manner. All right, so the next set of questions I'm going to go into relates to dependencies, and now I'm going to tackle 3 questions at the same time. So the first question kind of leads to the second, which is a bit more advanced, and then it leads to the third, which is the most advanced of the 3. So the first question is, in my opinion, the end-to-end system lead time should not be dependent on external parties. And what is my best practice advice here? So I'm not sure if this is the best practice advice, but this is a reasonably good advice. Is there's no wishful thinking in Kanban. So in Kanban, we model services as they are actually delivered to customers. Does your workflow include a dependency? If it doesn't include a dependency, lucky you, your Kanban board will not have, let's say, blockers due to that dependency. It will not have a parking lot for such dependency. It will not have a connection to another Kanban board. However, in a more realistic scenario that your workflow includes a dependency, it may be important to model it as part of your Kanban system. And so in this situation, we can basically pretend that the time in process is simply the sum of activity 1 and activity 3, and basically that's our perhaps responsibility, and simply not deal with the inconvenient dependency. However, that's not going to be very good by our customer standards. So if we actually recognize the dependency, then one possible way to visualize it is that we place a blocker on the work item, such as a work item B that gets blocked due to dependency being discovered. And then we go to another service that resolves the dependency. So there's a little Kanban board at the bottom where the blocker will get a matching work item. So that service will see our blocker as an incoming work item. Then perhaps they have some processing steps. Eventually, they solve the problem and resolve our dependency, at which point the work goes back to us. The work item B is unblocked and it resumes flow. Now, what's interesting, in this dependent service, we may not be the only customer. There may be other customers competing with us for the shared capacity of the dependent service. So this is a very common situation in the realistic knowledge-based product and services enterprises. There are customer-oriented workflows and there are shared services. And shared services are actually shared across many different sources of demand. So the next question is, now that we've accepted this reality that there may be a dependency and we learned how to model it, we have to understand what impact it has on our system. So that brings us to the next question, which is, Kanban is a pull system. We want to avoid exceeding WIP limits. Yes, that's a great idea. Then what is the best way to deal with the fact, well, it's great that we're now acknowledging the fact, of requiring sometimes the participation of external actors, such as subcontractors and outsourcing, that could delay the finishing, right? That could extend the lead time of the work item that we promised to a customer. So, limiting WIP. So my message here is WIP limits do not actually work by writing a number on the whiteboard with a marker. So let's say if on this particular whiteboard we wrote number 3 and we have 3 items A, B, C sitting in the dependency parking lot. Will you stop accepting new items in the activity X in your actual process? Does your actual process work like this? It probably doesn't work like that. Well, that means 3 is not your actual WIP limit, and that means your current board visualization doesn't actually visualize the actual policies of your process. Very likely, your WIP limit there is infinity, because you're never going to stop accepting items just because they're all stuck in the dependency parking lot. So if your WIP limit is infinity, is that a problem for you? Maybe it is, maybe not. How do we know? We have to ask our customers. What our customers likely care about is the lead time. Well, sure enough, with no clear WIP limits on an activity in the middle of your workflow, your lead time will likely be long and possibly unpredictable, and the customers might not be happy about it. And nowadays, we can actually quantify effects of dependencies on lead time. So just to give a simple example, on the left is a lead time histogram of a service, and it only includes cases when all dependencies were avoided. So it's simply variability inherent in the, let's say, product development process. So it's a relatively compact lead time distribution. It doesn't have a long tail stretching all the way into the unsatisfactory territory. However, let's say the service depends on a shared service, and the lead time of that shared service looks like a histogram on the right. And that's, by the way, a fairly typical lead time histogram for a shared service in great many technology companies. So if we start simulating the impact of dependency, you can see how, let's say we have a dependency with that kind of service delivery capability, and we hit it 50% of the time. So there is already a difference between the no dependencies chart and one dependency lead time chart. So we can see how the average lead time is expanding. We can also see how the variation of lead time is expanding, and we can also see how some extremely long lead times start appearing in the process. And if we had 2 dependencies, the situation gets worse, and if we had 3 dependencies, the situation gets worse. And what if actually each of those dependent services has a capability that's slightly worse? So you get the idea how dependencies can mess up our lead time. So I just drew this line through all these charts so that you can see how the amount of red, which is really the amount of work items that were delivered perhaps too late, can grow rapidly with addition only a few dependencies in the workflow. And this brings us to what can we do about this if this is not a satisfactory situation? So to limit WIP, work in progress, in a workflow with dependencies, you need a reliable time, a reliable lead time from the service that resolves the dependency. There's no magic there. If the amount of time your work items spend in the dependency parking lot is not bounded, if it stretches to infinity, you're going to have a very unpredictable lead time yourself. So the service, the shared service that provides something to you to resolve the dependency must improve to provide shorter and more predictable lead time. And that requires you as a service delivery manager of your service to work with the service delivery manager of the service you depend on, and you need to figure out the bargain that makes it so. So you need to figure out the balance of demand and capability on the shared service. And the shared service may not have, because it's a shared service, right? It likely has other customers. That means you may have to involve other service delivery managers as well, and it will be a multi-party bargain that basically assures that all the managers whose services depend on the shared service get predictable capability that is adequate for their purpose. And this is how Kanban is an organizational improvement method. You improve a network of services, not just the productivity of one service delivery group or a team. And that brings me to a more advanced question about dependencies. Dependencies seem to be a hard nut to crack. We're developing several big modules assigned to future teams. We try to minimize dependencies, but there will always be some. Okay, we're again acknowledging the fact. some of them known in advance, some to be discovered as we go. So that's an interesting insight by Georg from Norway, who asked this question. So sometimes dependencies are not known in advance. They're only discovered in the middle of a workflow dynamically. That means your lead time, the time it takes you to deliver something to a customer, will be inherently probabilistic, not deterministic. You cannot predict dependency and calculate its impact deterministically. You have to deal with probabilities of bad stuff happening. So our project manager keeps making plans in excruciating detail, which means the project manager is trying to create a deterministic model of a probabilistic process to optimize the schedule in light of these dependencies. But I was hoping I could suggest a better way. I would like to solve it with an algorithm, policies rather than a plan. How can Kanban help? All right, so we could have a whole webinar on this, but to keep it more concise, I will give a short answer to it. So Kanban definitely has an answer to this question. It's in the part of Kanban guidance known as Enterprise Services Planning. Specifically, it's the ESP guidance on dependency management, specifically about dynamic reservation systems. So ESP includes 5 classes of dependency management, although the 5 classes are used very unequally. Actually, class 1 covers more than half of the cases. It's a default class and simplest one to execute. Class 2, which is slightly more difficult, you add just 1 practice. That covers the majority of the rest of the cases. And if you run into a really difficult situation, there are 3 more classes that are reliant on dynamic reservation systems and also real options and reservation classes. You use those sparingly when your business risks justify the costs. So here's the matrix of these 5 classes. So we basically observed interactions in the real world between a service that is customer facing, that's visualized vertically here, and the service that resolves a dependency, delivers something to a customer-facing service. So we have a customer-facing service here and a shared service. So how do people typically approach dependencies in a customer-facing service? So sometimes they simply allow just-in-time dependency discovery. They kind of let it be. Sometimes they discover dependency deterministically when it can be done. It can be done, let's say, as part of a definition of ready for a work item. And sometimes they provide a fixed date class of service. I mean, the reality is fixed date class of service exists and services need to provide it sometimes. What can a dependent service do? Well, they can let it be, meaning all the demand from other services falls into their backlog. Somebody prioritizes backlog. The backlog team, the service team, pulls out of that backlog, does the work, completes the work. The result goes back to the service that they dependent on, that depends on them, sorry. Now, there is a better way to do it, which is a more sophisticated way, is to actually manage capacity on the shared service, model all of its sources of demand as work item types, and provide consistent capacity allocation against those work item types. That leads to more consistent lead times. That leads to shorter delays in the services that depend on the shared service. That improves customer satisfaction. So, but that's a little bit more expensive to do. And then the third most complicated thing that the shared service can do, it can provide reservation classes. So it can allow other services to book capacity on it. And so if you combine these 3 possibilities observed in the real world, we get 9 potential scenarios. Unfortunately, 4 of them are impossible or don't make sense. So we basically end up with 5 possible cases that are lined up along the diagonal here. And it turns out that the class 1 and class 2 actually handle quite a lot already, and so you just use classes 3, 4, and 5 sparingly. So what does it mean to use class 1 dependency management? You know your service's lead time, and your service's lead time histogram already embeds all information about your dependencies. And then you ask a question, when does your customer need something delivered? And then you ask the question, when do you need to start it? And the difference between the two is lead time. So you use your lead time capability with all dependency information embedded to simply start things on time with optimal amount of risk. So you minimize the schedule risk using your lead time information that already embeds all information about dependencies. And that's all really there is to it. Well, there may be situations when this is not satisfactory because, as we saw previously, when you embed all the dependency information in the lead time distribution will tell you, well, I'm too variable. And that's going to make it difficult to make a decision to start something. So in this case, we have a better option. Well, we manage capacity of shared services, and we shape demand on those services. So you can see the difference between the previous diagram is that the WIP limits appeared on the column, no, sorry, not on the column, but on the swim lanes in the shared service. So this shared service gets demand from multiple sources. Those sources are modeled as swim lanes on the shared service Kanban board, and each swim lane has a WIP limit. And that WIP limit will hold if a bargain is made about shaping demand on that service and provisioning its capacity appropriately to keep the demand and capability in balance. So if you achieve this, then you get short, predictable lead times from the shared service, and that improves predictability of the customer-facing service. So it turns out that the class 2 dependency management is only one difference: manage capacity on the shared service and shape demand on the shared service. So those two things bring the capability and demand on the shared service into balance. That is the greatest point of leverage in improving predictability of customer-facing services. And there is, of course, more detail in our enterprise services planning guidance, but because we don't have the whole webinar dedicated to that, I will just summarize it. You want to manage dependencies, you need to know your lead time. You need to know the lead time of your service. If you want to manage it a little better, then you have to manage capacity and shape demand on shared services. And in the rare cases when that's not enough, there are some other tricks available in our Kanban playbook. There was, now I'm getting into smaller questions. Fit for purpose. What parameters drive fit for purpose? So a straightforward answer to this is, here are some typical fitness criteria. And on the left, I just showed you a preview of the upcoming Fit for Purpose framework infographic. It will soon appear on the Fit for Purpose website. And it will also be included in the second edition of the Fit for Purpose book that Mahesh mentioned in the introduction. It will also be, I guess, handed out to participants of several upcoming conferences where Fit for Purpose is a relevant topic. So we have just completed the implementation of this infographic, and both David and I are quite excited about the quality of the graphic design. So the portion of the infographic that I'm showing you here shows the typical fitness criteria. And some of these criteria have something to do with time to market. Customers care about that a lot. And in time to market, we differentiate 3 different components. Sometimes it's the duration of time that they care about. Sometimes they care about predictability or the range of variation in lead time. And sometimes they care about timeliness, which is how likely are you, how close to 100% is that likelihood to hit a particular fixed date known in advance. Sometimes that is the fitness criterion. And you can satisfy it by being very fast or by being not very fast but starting on time and knowing when to start. But customers get the same result as far as timeliness. There may also be some quality criteria known as functional and non-functional. Functional is basically a what, and non-functional is how well. Functional is usually easier to achieve, and non-functional is harder. And there may also be various safety and regulatory conformance criteria that also drive fit for purpose. What's common to all of these criteria is that customers have some intuitive notion of them, and that's basically how they judge and select your product or service. So fitness is really in the eyes of customers. And here are some of the typical criteria that they use to judge. All right, so we've got some other questions. So I'm going to kind of keep this other questions title on the screen, and at the same time I'm looking at the list of questions that kind of smaller questions or questions that arrived pretty late. So I'm going to be mindful of time. We've got only a few minutes, so now I'm really going to take maybe a minute or two for each question. So let's see, I'm looking at the list. What have we not answered already? So applying Kanban outside the walls of IT, how to best communicate lean theory to those with no agile experience. So that's a good question for it. Actually, the phrasing of this question embeds several types of confusion. So let's clarify them right away. So are there walls of IT? Is IT a walled city? We don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it's not in a particular company. Are we inside those walls or outside those walls, or are there no walls? Let's not assume. Does your audience have agile experience or does it not? Regardless of those circumstances, here's practical advice. Do not teach lean theory. Do not teach lean theory. Understand the situation and give practical advice. Find the next evolutionary step out of what you do now. That's the essence of Kanban. It's not a translation of some lean theory to design your ideal process. So you don't need to communicate lean theory regardless of 6 other possibilities that you implied in this particular question. The next question, which Kanban metrics best inform future decisions? So as you already saw pretty much throughout this webinar, answer to pretty much every question involves understanding your lead time capability. You absolutely need to understand it. And your future decisions about commitments that your business is going to make will require data about time that elapsed since similar decisions made in the past. Therefore, the basic Kanban system metric, time measured from we promise to here it is extremely useful to a lot of decisions you're going to make in the future about delivering something to your customers. And there's another question here, and that might be our last question today. So a question from someone who applies Kanban in transformation in a logistics and customs team. They have 5 people and about 400 or so unique shipments per month. Actually, there are multiple questions about this. What could be the unit of work in the system in this Kanban system, I presume, comment visualizing 400 cards per month, and I presume all their movements will explode the board, and also how to set whip limits in such situation. All right, so let's start with the question about the unit of work or the work items. So you said 400 unique shipments. I assume those shipments have 400 unique customers who requested them. So 400 unique senders or recipients who care if that particular shipment was delivered on time, delivered safely, with its contents intact. And since you mentioned it involves customs, perhaps customs duties assessed correctly and payment collected correctly and not overcharged, mistakes not being made. So that suggests that one shipment is one work item, and shipment would be a work item type in your Kanban system. Now, how are you going to visualize 400 cards per month? So let's go back to the practices of a Kanban method. So one of the practices that usually occurs first on the list, right, starts with letter V. It does not say create a whiteboard and glue several hundred stickies to it and hire a full-time employee to move the stickies. Since you are in customs and shipment business, it's highly likely that you already have some kind of system for tracking shipments, such as when the shipment is sent, there's some scanning, and as a result of scanning, some timestamp is recorded in a database. I mean, shipment passes through several checkpoints, there's more scanning and more timestamps recorded in the database. So when, let's say, you have a software team where nobody knows who is working on what, to create a whiteboard and put 20 stickies on it actually creates a shared system of truth that would not exist otherwise. In your situation, you already have a system of record. What is exactly that you need to visualize that system doesn't show you already? You're in a very different situation. So you already track these 400 work items per month very well, presumably. So why would you need to switch to a much lower quality, low-tech, high-overhead system for doing that? So what may be more important as far as Kanban practices for you is make policies explicit. That's practice number 4 of the Kanban method. And implement feedback loops, the 5th practice of the Kanban method. So if you make policies explicit, how do those policies actually work? Do they lead to satisfactory customer outcomes? It's quite possible that they already do. So thanks to the feedback loop, you will find out. And let's say you already satisfy your customers very well. In that case, you don't need Kanban or any combination of its practices, least of all the whiteboard with post-its. Well, let's say there is a little bit of dissatisfaction, and the feedback loop will tell you about that. Let's say some shipments arrive a little late, or let's say they arrive with some mistakes, and now you have a problem to fix. Where would you start? Well, you've got explicit policies, right? Clearly, some of these policies aren't working. What would be the first policy that you would change to try to improve that situation? As a manager, that's your next move. It's not procuring the whiteboard or going to the office supply store for a stack of post-its. It's answering the question, what policy in your business you would change within your scope of responsibility to improve the customer outcome? What's your next move there? At some point, you might want to create some visual signal. Well, that visual signal might be about, let's say, a notification going on your phone, going off on your phone, saying such and such shipment has been in the blocked state due to reason such and such for the last 24 hours. It alerts to you to a problem that is perhaps non-trivial and deserves your attention, and it doesn't bother you with irrelevant noise and useless information. As far as work in process limits, so let's do a little bit of calculation. How long does that shipment processing takes? I don't know, the question doesn't specify that, but let's say it takes a day or a few. That suggests that there's probably several tens of shipments or customs forms in process at the same time being worked on in a team of 5. So it's quite likely there's some queuing in your process, and that's where some time is wasted. So as a manager, can you do something about those queues to reduce the time it takes for your shipments to be processed? Now, can you imagine a notification going on your phone alerting you that a queue between 2 activities in your workflow has just exceeded, let's say, a critical threshold of 20 items? That means there are 20 shipments not going anywhere at the time. And that notification asks you, what are you going to do about it? What is your next move? And by the way, that notification is your WIP limit. It's not a number you write on a whiteboard with a marker. So application of Kanban method in such environments requires really thinking about what business you're in, who your customers are, and how do you make your process more explicit, how you understand it better, how you match it up with customer expectations, how do you validate that it is working, that it is improving, and how do you know that it's improving? And of course, all of those questions are a little bit deeper than how do we visualize our work using some technique that perhaps is out of completely different context and perhaps not even working there. So with that, Mahesh, I think I need to hand it over to you. We're at 12:25 where I am right now, and that tells me that perhaps it's time to wrap it up and either close the webinar or take just a few very short questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexei. Great presentation as always, and some really relevant questions that we hear from our clients all the time about people implementing Kanban, getting started with Kanban, or people who have been working on Kanban for some time and are now getting into more advanced topics such as dependency management and capacity planning, things like that. I think we hear these kind of questions all the time from people who are moving from a more traditional project management approach to working with a Kanban system where you're looking at delivering incremental pieces of value with using the Kanban system that helps you get better at firstly understanding your capability to deliver, and then of course using that to forecast future performance. So excellent set of questions. Thank you for the to the people who sent all those questions, and for people who may have not had a chance. Hopefully you all learned from the session today. Looks like, Alexei, given the nature of the webinar, that there aren't any more questions that are come up from the webinar so far. So we will close it, and we will follow up with any questions that are there with direct emails to those of you who have questions and would like to send us those questions. So thank you all. Thank you, Alexei, once again for this excellent webinar. Once again, there are a couple of comments that are just coming in. Yes, we will send you a recording of the webinar. And Alexei, will you be able to share the slides for this webinar that you presented?
Yes, Mahesh, I will send you the PowerPoint. And I want to thank you for the invitation, and thank you for everyone who signed up and sent a question, and for everyone and to everyone who listened.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Thank you all who joined the webinar today. We have a great rest of the day, and we hope you'll join us in a future webinar. Alexei, thanks a lot once again. Take care.